So today we are going to be talking a little bit about serving kids with confidence. So kind of just some customer service strategies for frontline staff for working with kids, interacting with kids, things like that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just interacting with children kind of in general. So the first thing to keep in mind is that you want to talk to them. You don't want to talk around them. And even if they're with a caregiver, acknowledge them directly. A simple hello or a compliment can leave a positive impression on a child. And sometimes we have a tendency to just talk to the adult and ignore the child. So if you can, acknowledge the child as well, even if it's just saying hi. And on that note, try to be more casual instead of super serious if you can. Obviously, certain situations do demand a more serious demeanor. And for a lot of kids, they may have a previously conceived idea of what a library is. I'm sure you guys, in media a lot of the time, it looks like a scary place where it's like, shh, we're quiet, we're very, collected together, we whisper, we walk, we sit, we whisper, all that, where that's not always the case. And their only exposure to a library setting may have been a library at school. So they may feel intimidated. So just kind of be aware of that. And something else to think about is to make sure that you're respecting their boundaries. So it can be tricky to juggle wanting to have a positive interaction with a child while also making sure that you're respecting their boundaries. And don't take it personally if they don't seem interested in interacting with you. They might have a certain level of stranger danger. Even if you're someone they see from time to time, they might just be in a bad mood. They may have taken a shorter nap. They may have not eaten breakfast or eaten all their breakfast. So don't take it personally if they want nothing to do with you that particular day. And offering stickers can sometimes be your golden ticket. If you happen to have extra stickers, that could be something good to keep at the desk with you. Tattoos, temporary tattoos, bookmarks, something like that. You could try a puppet, but make sure it's not scary. That's kind of something you might want to use your own best judgment about. But also don't push, which I know can feel a little counterintuitive after I'm telling you, try to interact. Because at the end of the day, respecting a child's boundaries and saying, okay, I'm going to stay here. I can tell you're a little uncomfortable. I'm just, going to wave. That's it. In their mind, that's still a positive interaction, and you're building that trust that may then eventually lead to maybe in a month when they come to the library, they come up to you and feel brave enough to ask for a sticker because you know that they're someone that they can trust. And another thing is you can show them that you're interested. And this isn't too terribly difficult. It can be as simple as just asking about what they're checking out, commenting on what they're checking out. If it's maybe they're checking out the Boxcar Children and you loved the Boxcar Children as a kid, you could just mention that. Or if they're checking out a book about owls and you happen to love owls, don't overthink it, though. It's kind of similar to how you would just casually interact with an adult patron. But at the same time, don't feel like you have to lie. If they're checking out a Captain Underpants book and you have avoided Captain Underpants like the plague your entire life, they can tell. So don't feel like you have to force some type of an interaction. Kids are very perceptive. And this type of interaction can also give you an in for future interactions. So then when they've returned the book, you can ask them how they've liked it. You can keep an eye out to suggest other books that you think they might enjoy that are similar. And another thing to keep in mind is to be patient. It can often take children a lot longer to do things than it would take adults, and it can also take them longer to verbally explain exactly what they need help with. They can understand what they're trying to say, but it ends up coming out kind of in a roundabout way. And you can't wait all day, but also keep in mind that they're practicing being independent and interacting with unknown adults, and the reality is a library is one of the safe spaces for them to do that. So if you don't have a great big long line, you can take the time to let them ask you themselves. And if you have the time, and keep instructions simple, don't use 1 or 2 steps at a time. If it's complicated, they're not gonna remember. Just, in the children's room, this shelf on your left, or don't give them great big long, do this, 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 because the reality is they're only going to remember the first 2 or 3. And like adults, they can get off topic pretty often. I'm sure you've all had adult patrons who will come up and just start telling you all about their day, everything that's happened, and you're kind of like, okay. So a lot of the same strategies you use with adult patrons, you can turn around and use with kids. You can just say, wow, that's so interesting. So let's find that book. What could I help you with today? Oh, if they're telling you all about their dog, we have some great books on dogs. So same way you would with adults, just spin it around. And the reality is they're probably going to tell you things that you don't think you should know. And you just smile and say, okay, great, and move on. And try not to baby talk younger children. Children all generally want to feel like they're older than they are, or they already think that they're older than they are. So if you treat them like they're younger, generally they'll get a negative impression of you because they think that you're babying them. And it can feel a little strange because sometimes you try to use a higher pitched tone with babies, but the reality is dumbing down the language is actually, it hinders development. It doesn't help development. So while you can use a higher pitched tone, don't dumb down the language used, if that makes sense. And children's receptive language develops a lot faster than their expressive language. So just keep that in mind when you're interacting with them, because a 2 or 3-year-old, half of what comes out of their mouth might still be gibberish. They don't have the words for every single thing they want to ask you, even a 1.5-year-old, but they can generally understand exactly what you're saying. So just kind of keep that in mind. And respect is a two-way street. If you make a child feel like you're disrespecting them, or maybe, you're belittling them, you're treating them like a baby, then they're going to find it harder to respect you. And another thing to keep in mind is that children are a lot more capable than we might think. Give them opportunities to give them themselves, do things themselves if you can. If they want to and are old enough, you could help show them how to utilize your library's catalog to find things themselves. Maybe if you have computers with your card catalog on it, or how to navigate the shelves. These are where you can find the chapter books. This is where you can find the nonfiction books. Here's how to find the nonfiction books on whales. And again, that can really depend on how much time you have, what kind of branch you're in. Obviously, if you have a line of like 6 or 7 people and you're at the desk by yourself, that may not be realistic. But maybe if things are slower and you have a few minutes, that could really help them to feel more empowered. But at the same time, keep in mind some kids might just want you to help them, and that's totally okay as well. It's kind of just, kids are so different, even the same age, even, similar families, completely different personalities. So you kind of just have to gauge the kid that you're talking to. And also don't assume their ability or their age based on appearance. Children can look a lot older than they are. Maybe they're super tall, or they can look a lot younger than they are. So if you can avoid it, don't make a ton of assumptions. I've known children, especially around like 5, 6, 7, where some of them have hit that growth spurt and started to get taller, but some of them are still shorter and smaller and maybe may look like they're still 4 or 5 years old when they're 6 or 7, very independent. So that's also something to keep in mind, is don't then assume that they're younger than they actually are and lower your expectations of them. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is dealing with misbehavior, which is something I know can seem really intimidating and, may not be why you think I got into this, or why I come to work every day is to, get kids to stop running or screaming or shouting, or, the things that kids are going to do. So here's just a few tips that maybe I'm not going to say a pleasant experience, but it could maybe make it a slightly less stressful experience for you. So the first thing is just to keep your expectations realistic. Kids are going to find a way to make a mess, whether it's with craft supplies, whether they're leaving materials out, whether they're not pushing in chairs or putting things back like they're supposed to. And don't take anything they say or do too personally. They could be having a bad day. They could just be going through a phase where they're feeling rebellious. Kids are also still learning how to deal with their emotions. And sometimes those emotions could come out in a way that seems unkind or angry. And they're also learning to test those social boundaries with different adults. So try not to take it too personally if you can. And they can be very active, energetic, loud, which I know goes against all of the things you think of when you think of that stereotypical library. And it's okay to an extent. So what we're going to talk about is dealing with children and interacting with them and kind of helping to get them back on track when it gets to that extent where it's no longer appropriate and kids just being kids. So before anything happens, you need to make sure that you're covered. So know your library system's policies, particularly on patron behavior and unattended children. Unattended children, I would especially say, maybe you keep it somewhere by the desk. You have the ages highlighted just so if it comes up, this is the age that we've said is okay to be unattended in the library. And make sure you know how to access these in case you need them or they're requested by a patron. And you never know when someone might complain or disagree, or you have to use a policy, to go speak with a caregiver, or escalate a situation. And so just make sure that you can back yourself up with those relevant policies. And so something else to keep in mind is to try to manage your tone and volume. When we get emotional, it's easy for our voice and body language to reflect your emotions, especially when it's a strong emotion like anger, fear, frustration, because generally kids react better to a calm presence than a stressed one. And they're kind of like mirrors. So if you come at a situation, maybe you're here, they're going to meet you here. So try to come at them calmly, and they're more likely to react to you calmly. If that makes sense. Because if your emotions are running high, their emotions are going to run high, and then it's just kind of going to keep compounding on itself. And try to use positive phrasing. And this doesn't mean, you never correct behavior. What it means is generally you just tell them what you would like them to do versus what they can't do. Kids tend to be more receptive when you do this. Sometimes they can get defiant or defensive when they're told not to do something. Sometimes they just may not realize what the appropriate behavior is. In their brain, they can't always make, especially if it's something where the answer isn't always apparent, they can't always make that logical leap. So, for example, instead of telling them to stop running, tell them to walk in the library. Instead of telling them not to talk so loud, tell them to use their inside voice. Instead of telling them don't leave the books laying around, say put those books in that bin. And this is a good example of why it's important to use that positive phrasing and tell them what you would like them to do. Because if you just say don't leave the books laying around, they could leave them on the table in a stack, but that might not be where you want them. They could put them back on the shelves in completely the wrong spot. They could put them on a chair. They could put them on the floor, but they're in a nice little stack. They're not laying around. So that way then you can say, I asked you exactly what I wanted you to do. There's no room for misconceptions. And try to be aware and cognizant of the tone that you use with children. Don't yell or come off too angry or harsh, because this could escalate an interaction that may have otherwise just been a reminder. Because if you yell at a child, likelihood is they're immediately going to get nervous and defensive. And when they're defensive, they're going to respond in that way where maybe they're going to be defiant, they're going to argue back, they're going to yell back. So just try to avoid yelling if at all possible, unless it's like they're across the library and they're climbing on a shelf and you have to yell for them to be able to hear you. If it's like a safety situation, then obviously yell so they get down and they can hear you, so that they don't fall off in the time it takes you to walk over there. But if you can, try to keep your voice calm and level, and don't come off as stressed or frustrated or angry. And this can always feel a little awkward, but if you can, use caregivers as a resource. If maybe you've addressed the behavior with a child, you've said, please walk in the library, you've said, please talk quietly, use your inside voice, and they're still not listening, you can use their caregivers as a tool. A lot of children may be more likely, not in every case, so this is, again, you have to use discretion and it could backfire. A lot of children will probably be more likely to listen to their caregiver and respond better to them and do what they ask, because that's someone they're obviously very familiar with who is in a position of authority. And at the same time, use discretion. Don't go to a caregiver for every little thing. If it's something as simple as, hey, they're running and it's the first time, you can just, ask them nicely first and see if they'll stop. If it's something little like, they didn't put the caps on the markers or try to use that discretion, just because the caregiver may not take you seriously, and then that could backfire in the way that they interact with you or the way that they react when something big does happen. And if a caregiver isn't helpful or they get defensive, it's okay to go to your manager for support. Don't be afraid to say, well, we're going to pull in someone else that you can talk to, because if you're the person who comes at them immediately, their reaction may be rough or defensive. Whereas if you're bringing in someone else that they haven't interacted with, it kind of gives them a fresh start and a way to have an interaction with someone that their defenses aren't already up. And so just a few other things to keep in mind. Be firm and consistent in what you're saying. If you come off as wishy-washy, they won't listen, they may not take you seriously, and use discretion when addressing misbehavior with a child or teen or with a caregiver, and also know when to give you space, give them space, because sometimes you purely responding to a behavior can escalate the behavior. So that would be a time to ask the caregiver to step in, or go to a manager or another coworker, or just kind of step back and observe and see what will happen. And what you're comfortable with is really going to differ from person to person, but kind of a good rule of thumb is to make sure that you address behaviors that are disruptive. So if something is to the point where it's disrupting other patrons, then that's probably something you need to go ahead and distress. If it's destructive, they're destroying things, pulling books off shelves, ripping pages, that's absolutely something you need to address. And then something that's dangerous, and that's something that you also need to make sure that you address. And so another thing to keep in mind is building relationships with children a lot of the time can really help you out in the long run. It can make their experience more positive, and then it can also really come in handy if you do end up having to address misbehavior. But I also want to acknowledge that the ability to do this can really be dependent on the population that you serve, your branch. It could be, staff capabilities, the size of your branch, the hours that people come in. Do you get regulars that you get to interact with? Is your schedule the same every week? So these are just some tips to keep in mind, but don't feel like, oh, if I can't build relationships, kids are never going to listen to me. So a few things to consider is that building relationships can help to improve a kid's overall experience at the library, and it can make it a fun place to be because they'll get excited to come to the library, find books if you have things set up, but they also might get excited to come see you. And building relationships can also be helpful if you have to correct a child's behavior, because them listening to Morgan, who checks out my books every day and loves my shoes and asks me about what I'm reading and asks me about how school was or my soccer game, is probably going to go over a lot better than the adult who's back at the desk and scans my books and checks them back in, and that's really all the experience they've had with you. And on the flip side of that, it's a lot easier to then say, Riley, stop running, versus, hey, you, stop running. Because they may not realize who you're talking to. They're probably not going to listen as well. And then they have that, well, you weren't talking to me. And then you have to say, okay, well, what's your name, when you're already in the middle of trying to correct behavior and address a situation. And so if you've had a chance to watch the Ryan Dowd trainings, this kind of will probably seem similar. You can think of it like Pennies in the Cup Junior. If you haven't had a chance to watch those trainings yet, it essentially means that you should have a reserve of positive past interactions that you can draw on with a patron that you can use when you have to make some type of a rule enforcement interaction. And we have access to those, or you have access to those in MLC's Niche Academy. If your library director has not shared the information about getting started with you, you can ask them to help you so that you can get an account created. There's some great trainings on there. They're doing a series, a 3-part series right now about dealing with teenagers. There's a really great one on there about unattended children, ornery teenagers, and then just a lot that could come in handy in your day-to-day work anyway. And a lot of the concepts they talk about can definitely be applied to working with children, especially working with teenagers. Okay, and so one last thing to think about, it might seem a little cheesy, but just to kind of help to put it into perspective, is that the children who come into your library today could grow up to be your potential future patrons. They could be the teens and the adults that when they're old enough to make the choice for themselves, instead of having someone bring them, who say, I want to keep coming because I had fun at the library when I was a kid. I want to keep coming because the library wasn't a scary place. It was a place where I felt safe. And yes, I had boundaries, which kids thrive on boundaries. They don't think that they do, but they do. And then they can keep coming. And even the smallest interaction, like saying hi or offering a sticker or asking them about their day, can help to create lifelong patrons by planting those positive seeds. And I think that is all I have for today.